Hello from Paris. My name's Felix. I'm from Ledger. Welcome. Today I'm going to be going through a general onboarding of your device, I want to come from the perspective of if you're getting set up for the first time. So before I get too ahead of myself, first thing I'd want to mention is that if you do have any trouble with your devices in general that I can't help here, you can always get a hold of us on support.ledger.com. You can also pop your questions in the chat as well. But one thing to mention is that we won't ask for your recovery phrase at all. I always try to stress that because it is something that that scammers might ask you for potentially, and it is something that you want to keep in mind. I'll go into best practices down the line as well. So we're just going through the process of as if we're onboarding, getting our hardware wallet for the first time. Then just some best practices, like I mentioned. So first things first, I wanted to mention what is a hardware wallet. I really hope that you guys already know what that would be. If you're not aware, that's what I'm here for. It is a wallet that you would essentially input your recovery phrase, and that recovery phrase is something that you would use where the private keys are derived from, and you can sign transactions with them. So with all hardware wallets, it's something to keep in mind that you'll want to make sure you always have a backup of your recovery phrase, whether that's off-site or something like that. That way, in case anything happens, let's say you lose your device or it gets destroyed physically somehow, then you always have a backup to be able to access whatever assets you have as well. So yep, like I mentioned, pop your questions in the comments. We'll try to do our best to answer them a little bit down the line as well. So the first kind of question I wanted to go through would be what ledger might be right for you. If you've already purchased it, you can potentially jump past this part. But if you haven't purchased one before, there are 3 devices that we would have at the moment. So that's the Stacks, which has just been announced, something that I'm really keen to get my hands on myself, the Ledger Nano X and the Ledger Nano S Plus. I think one of the biggest differences with them to decide which one's best for you would be that the Ledger Nano S Plus has no Bluetooth and no battery. So when you are connecting it, that's what I have down here. If you see on the bottom right there, I've connected that via USB. You can connect that via USB-C to your phone as well if you're on Android, which I do myself. My phone is a OnePlus and I've got a USB-C. So I use a USB-C to USB-C cable. If you only use an iPhone, maybe you might want to use the Ledger Nano X because that has the Bluetooth capability to be able to connect to an iPhone if you only manage your device via iPhone. Although it should be mentioned that you potentially would need to use a computer. You can use a friend's computer potentially to upgrade the firmware. And the Ledger Stacks has Bluetooth, same with the Ledger Nano X. You can see as well, it's got the e-ink screen and everything like that as well. So just some things to keep in mind depending on what device you think is best for you. If you ever have any doubts, you can always come to us. If there's a specific asset that you want to manage and you're not sure is supported, you can always go to supported. You can check our website and it'll have a support, what we support. You can search it up and you can see here, for example, if I type Matic, which is the ticker for Polygon, you can see here it's supported as an ERC20 token, Polygon, anything like that. So you can double check all of that as well, just in case you had any questions regarding that. So let's say you've picked a device. Let's say you've purchased the Ledger Nano S Plus. You only need to connect to your computer and you're trying to manage some crypto assets. Maybe you're taking some off an exchange or something like that. I know that's a common scenario that some people would have had. Right. So first thing we do is, of course, we might unbox the device. and get that all plugged in and stuff like that. You won't see what I'm seeing here, but I'll go through what you might see in particular. And if you're not aware, I do have one of my colleagues in the chat answering questions, and I can try to get to them as well if need be too. But let's jump on. We'll download. What we need to download is not only potentially Ledger Live, if that's what you're going to be using to manage your assets. So it's not mandatory for managing your assets, but obviously we're a little biased here. So you can download Ledger Live by going to ledger.com. Make sure you go to ledger.com. Don't go to any other third-party websites or anything like that. That's really important. You can go to apps and services and you can download Ledger Live there. And you can see, you can download it based on which operating system that you're using as well. And you can see all that here. So I know that I've already installed Ledger Live on my device, just to make it easier for us going forward. And I can open that up here. This is the screen that you'll see for the first time if you're using Ledger Live for the first time. Right. And what it actually does is it actually gives you a short guide as to how to get set up. So you can actually see what I'm seeing on my device in particular. And I think it's really a good idea to just read through. There's even like a little quiz and things like that, just to make sure, to give you a bit of a confidence to manage the assets that you might need to do. So in our case, we know we have a Ledger Nano S Plus, and we can select that. And then if you are setting up for the first time, like you can see here, you can select set up a new Nano S Plus for the first time. I'll actually do that, even though it isn't my first time, and that way you'll be able to see the process about what would happen. When you do get your Ledger device, you should have a recovery sheet. It might not look like this one in particular. This one is for one of the newer devices, but it is something that you will receive when you purchase the Ledger device. You can see we've got a couple of basic slides here just to give you an idea for what the Ledger will do. So you've got how to access your crypto, what it means to own your private keys to your assets, and things like that. And I'd make sure to read through those just to make sure you understand. And then that way you can get through this process. 30 minutes I feel like is on the longer side in this case, but it might take you a little while, especially if it's your first time. Finances can be stressful, I totally understand. So it's always better to take your time and understand what you're doing. So in this case, it'll, like I said, guide you through the process. It'll actually ask you to set up your PIN first. You'll understand that the PIN is something that only you have. Once you set up the PIN code on the device, you can see here all the very specific instructions. So hopefully you'll be able to get through that. If you're setting up, if this is the first time with a hardware wallet, then most likely you'll get the recovery phrase from the device, like in these steps that I'm really skimming through at the moment. But if you have a recovery phrase from another software wallet, for example, it is something that is technically possible to import into your Ledger device. It's not something we recommend, generally speaking, because we're not sure about the randomness of the recovery phrase, potentially. And if it has already been compromised, then it could be a vector by which someone could take the assets. So it is definitely something to keep in mind. I wanted to mention that as a possibility. So instead of getting the recovery phrase from the device, the Ledger device generating your recovery phrase, you could set up as set up with an existing recovery phrase. But like I mentioned, there are potential pitfalls and some things to consider. So if you're ever in doubt, like I said, shoot us an email. We'll try to get to you as soon as we can. So in the process of getting all that done, let's say you've confirmed what should have happened is I'll get the recovery phrase from the device. I really wanted to at least go through these steps and making sure to know that the guide that they have at the start of Ledger Live is really in depth and it's really worth going through. Boom. So make sure you hide your recovery phrase. So let's say that I've written down my recovery. This one is empty in this particular case, but I'd want to make sure that I've written down my recovery phrase and, you know, I store it at my mom's house, my sister's house, my brother's house, something like that. And you can see that it's asking me to take a quiz now. Just to make sure that I understand what happened, what I did, and just to give you a better idea to be able to manage those assets. So as a Ledger user, your crypto is stored on the blockchain because remember, it's the recovery phrase that's on the device, and it's the recovery phrase that you derive the private keys from that you use to sign your transactions. So if my recovery phrase is no longer secure or private, the crypto is no longer safe. If someone has the recovery phrase, let's say I'd written it down here and I showed it to you guys, then the recovery phrase, anyone could put that into another Ledger wallet, any other software wallet even, and they could manage those assets without your consent. So it's the recovery phrase that is really important, as well as your PIN, to make sure all the ways that you can manage your assets are secure. All right. And then there's one more question that it'll ask as well, that when I connect my Nano to the Ledger app, my private keys are still offline. Why is that? It's because the recovery phrase, as I mentioned, is always on there. Just to give you a bit of a background of how it works, when I use a third-party wallet, or I use Ledger Live more likely, and I send a transaction, what I actually do is I use Ledger Live to build that transaction. I say, okay, I want it to do this, this, and this. And then I send that transaction, all its data, into my Ledger device to sign that transaction, to say, hey, can you sign this transaction? You might look at the details on the device itself and say, hey, it's sending to this address, it has this nonce, for example, and we can get into that later. But it'll show you the details of the transaction you're signing. It'll sign the transaction, and it'll give out back to Ledger Live, or the third-party wallet, the actual transaction itself. All right. So the private keys always stay on the device. So they're always offline. Even if you connect it, in my case, it's still offline because I've connected it to my laptop doesn't mean my recovery phrase isn't online. Only if I, let's say, take a photo of it and store it on a cloud service, that's a no-no. All right, so last part is it'll actually check the genuineness of the device, the hardware integrity and the software integrity. One thing you'll see that you should be able to see there, that the Ledger device will say that to allow Ledger Manager, and you can see to deny on the right, but to allow, I click both of those buttons when I'm on that page. Ledger device will double check, Ledger Live will double check the Ledger device, and we're all good to go. Great. There you go. Then we'll wait for that to load up. Then once that's all loaded up, the next part that we'd want to consider would be how to add an account. I wanted to go through that process, or I wanted to start with that first, and then go on to, any more specific scenarios that you might encounter, and go from there. Why you'd add an account? Let's say in the case of withdrawing from an exchange, would be to get the address that you want the exchanger to send it to, the address that the recovery phrase that's on this device manages on the particular network that you need to do. So, for example, when we add an account, we'd want to add the account for a specific type of asset, generally speaking. It might be more precise. We can be more precise, rather. It might be which type of blockchain, but I'll show you what I mean by that here. So the two biggest, or the two most common assets would be Bitcoin and Ethereum that you can see here. Bitcoin works in a model called UTXO, which is unspent transaction outputs, which I might get to towards the end. But with Ethereum, you might be sending Ethereum from the exchange, or you might be sending a token. One thing to note, that if you're sending a token, that you'll need the native token, generally speaking, of that network to pay for transaction fees. What I mean by that is, if I'm sending an ERC20 token, let's say USDT, you can see Ethereum there, on the Ethereum network, so that's an ERC20 token, then I would need to have, well, not from the exchange, the first one, but let's say the exchange, in this case, let's say they're sending it to me, will need to use Ethereum to pay for transaction fees. That's why you might see for a lot of exchanges, a withdrawal fee. They normally use that to pay for transaction fees, generally speaking. So with Ethereum, it'll be Ethereum. You might have something like Polygon, where you might use Matic, which is the ticker for that native token. You might need to use, if you have Avalanche, AVAX C chain, which you might not use with Ledger Live, but with anyone. With AVAX C chain, you'll need AVAX as well. So it just depends on the network that you're using, and you should be pretty already familiar with that asset if you're sending a token. But of course, get a hold of us if you need to, if you have any questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend like I'm going to withdraw Bitcoin in this case. That way I can talk about the other kinds of things that you might come across as well. And it's, it's the most popular. Again, hopefully a lot of the questions are getting answered in the chat, but I can always go through those towards the end as well. Now you can see here, it's asking me to install the application. Luckily for us, in terms of Ledger Live, it'll actually, because we've already allowed the Ledger Manager to be able to make changes to the device, the Ledger Live is automatically going to say, hey, you need Bitcoin, the Bitcoin application, to add any accounts, or any Bitcoin accounts. I always think of your Bitcoin account, your Bitcoin application rather, it's kind of like a handbook for your Ledger device to be able to interact with that particular blockchain. Because we do get a couple of questions that ask, if you need to, let's say, uninstall an application, will I lose access to my assets? And you won't. Remember, it'll be the recovery phrase that, gives you access to the accounts, right? The private keys, it's the public-private key pair that is the relationship that allows you to sign those transactions, and the addresses are essentially derived from the public key. So if the application doesn't actually have anything to do with what the recovery phrase is or anything like that, but it helps the Ledger device. I'm just going to open the application on the bottom, if you can see that there. What the application does is it helps with in layman's terms, I like to think of it as a translation from the recovery phrase using the derivation path, and knowing what network we're going to be using, in this case Bitcoin, to manage whatever asset we might need to manage. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much with regard to that. Hopefully that makes sense. Looks like, okay, so obviously it doesn't look like we're having the best time with Ledger Live. It's a bit slow. We can always get around this. We can go back, we can cancel that, and we can try it again. Now that we already have the Bitcoin application, we can just give it another try. You can see here that I need to update my firmware. And I'm going to do this after we add the account, just so you guys get a better idea. I want to make sure that it's always a good idea, and I'll get into this later, to make sure all your firmware is up to date and everything like that. So let's add a Bitcoin account. With Bitcoin in particular, you're going to get a lot of, not a lot, you might get a set of types of accounts that you can add. And this is specific to Bitcoin and Bitcoin-like assets in this particular case. And you might have heard of them before. I'll mention them now. They're things like Legacy, SegWit, Native SegWit, and Taproot. These are essentially versions of addresses. I'm not sure if it's entirely necessary to go into the details of the specifics, but to say if you are withdrawing, let's say Bitcoin from an exchange, it's just good to double check if they support native SegWit addresses, Taproot addresses, SegWit, Legacy. I might add them all and I'll show you. Well, let's add 2 and we'll show you. But you can potentially check what type of address you're using based on the prefix. But let's get into that into a second. So let's add the accounts and go from there. Once we add the accounts, what do we need if we're going to withdraw from an exchange? We're going to need to get an address. So we'll go through what is the receive process. We're going to want to receive assets. We want to make sure we're receiving it to the right address. We don't want it to, let's say, have it be received on an incorrect wallet or anything like that, obviously. So I want to receive, let's say I go to my exchange, Binance, Coinbase, whatever, and it says, hey, we support native SegWit addresses. Okay, that's perfect. I'm going to go select continue, and I'm going to check what my current receive address is for Bitcoin. What it'll do, it'll actually ask the device, I was like, hey, I need you to verify an address at this particular derivation path, for example, just to make sure that you have the right one. And it's important here, we don't show the address here and the address here for no reason. The reason for that, so you can check BC1Q, M0ZY, LF, and so on and so forth. Good to check maybe the first dozen or so, last dozen. That's actually a lot, to be honest, but good to always check the addresses. Why is that? If we made the assumption that the computer was compromised, let's say the address here is shown, that's being shown is different from the one that's on the device itself. We know that's a huge red flag. Something is going on. Why would this instance of Ledger Live be showing a different address? Could there be some kind of phishing attempt be attempted? Is there something that is clogging up your clipboard with regards to, let's say, checking if you have any cryptocurrency addresses and replacing it with an attacker's address, for example? Those are really common examples of how malware can potentially have you perform actions that compromise your security without ever getting the recovery phrase. And so that's why we make sure if you go through the receive process, you can check that against not only that against what is shown on the device. What is shown on the device is always going to be what hopefully you're signing. So when you're sending and stuff like that, or if you verify an address, that one should be, the one on the device should be reality. And the reason for that is because, as I think we mentioned before, the recovery phrase doesn't leave the device. So the private keys don't. And so it means that, if I'm going to verify, I go down into the device to verify and make sure what I'm verifying on the device is correct. The same can be said for Ethereum addresses as well. Just that one thing to note about Bitcoin addresses is that once I've sent a transaction to that address, so let's go through that again, that receive process again. If I go through and I get a different address, there could be a couple of things that might have happened. So let's say I withdrew from the exchange and I received my Bitcoin. I received my 1 Bitcoin and I put that onto that address that I just showed you before. If I go through the receive process again, then what's going to happen is that I should get a different address. Is that supposed to happen? Yes, that's the first thing that I'd mention. Why is that? It's actually part of the way that Bitcoin and Bitcoin-like transactions, so transactions, a Bitcoin and Bitcoin-like currencies or assets work, in that they use a UTXO model. So you can still actually send to that same address, but the new address has been created that you still control the private keys for, so that it retains or it helps with some semblance of privacy. That's really important if, because all of these transactions are public on chain, privacy can be an issue. So this is why there is this protocol in place. Now, what I actually did while I was talking about that is I actually went through the receive process, but I did so for the legacy account. And you can see here, the legacy prefix is 1. And if you remember correctly, the prefix that there was before for the other account was a BC1Q, if I remember correctly. So just something to consider. Just wanted to show you guys what the addresses would look like if they're for different account types. And if you're using an EVM or an Ethereum address, EVM being an Ethereum virtual machine, so you'll see generally you'll notice that they are, because a lot of their transaction IDs and their addresses start with 0x. So just something, I'll just approve that because we can assume that's the same, and we're good to go from there. All right. So hopefully you have a better idea of how to withdraw from the exchange. So I should have let's say gone to Binance.com, Coinbase.com. You log in. It'll ask you potentially to add an address into its watch list or its whitelist or whatever, and then you can withdraw to specific addresses. Is generally the process when you're using withdrawing from exchanges. Other than that, one other thing to mention with regards to Ethereum addresses. If you're withdrawing Ethereum, a lot of the tokens actually appear on a lot of different EVM compatible networks. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So let's add the Ethereum account, and hopefully I might give you an Ethereum address that you could, that way you can get your Ethereum address and you can check it on different networks and things like that, just to give you a better idea of what might be happening. And then maybe the last thing that we'll do before trying to maybe answer any questions potentially is we'll go through the process of updating firmware and common issues, best practices, and stuff like that as well. But one thing to note, I think I mentioned before, if you're not aware, is that transactions on chain, whether it be Bitcoin, Ethereum, on side chains like Polygon or layer 2s like Optimism, Arbitrum potentially, whatever network or it might be, you should be able to check any actions that you do on things that are called block explorers. So that's for Ethereum, it'll be something like Etherscan. For something like Bitcoin, there are a couple of options, but Blockchair, as you can see, is one of them. Blockstream, if I remember correctly as well. There are a couple of block explorers that you can use. Some are not necessarily universal, but manage to incorporate multiple networks. And the reason I bring up these block explorers is because I wanted to give you a better idea of what it might look like if you have transactions on one network or the other, or what you might see. Let's say, because it is something that could potentially happen if you're withdrawing from an exchange. Let's see, I need to boom the Ethereum account open just to get this boom to work. Perfect. Connected, unlocked as well. And if you do experience any issues like this, you can see how we might try and troubleshoot that as well. Okay, so something is awry. Let's say, potentially. I doubt it in this case because I know I've worked with this device before, but what we might do, let's say, okay, something doesn't seem to be connecting. First thing I'd do is I'd update the firmware. Updating the firmware is always something that I'd recommend. To do so, you'd go to the My Ledger, you can see on the bottom left here, and it's asking you to connect and unlock the device. And you might ask, yeah, my device is connected and unlocked. Why is it asking me to do so? It's because I'm in an application. So I'll just need to quit the application, and now I'm on our home screen, and you should be able to see that there. Okay, so now it's still not connecting. What can I do? Next thing, I'm just disconnect and reconnect. I think I set up the device beforehand, so you guys didn't see me input this, but this is not my real pin, and this isn't a pin that you should use as well. Boom. So I'll log back in, and we'll double check if it's working or not. Okay, so that's not working. I'm a little impatient, of course, so we'll just make sure to open Ledger Live again. So you see, I jumped the gun here. You see, open allow Ledger Manager. So Ledger Live had just asked my device to allow it, and I closed it way too quickly. So we deny that. That's okay. And we'll wait for Ledger Live to open again so that we can get that all set up. In the meantime, let's actually show you what I mean in terms of different networks. I'm going to use my personal address just to give you a better idea of what that might look like. Now, if you don't know, this .eth is an ENS domain. It's a way you can potentially, it's essentially an asset that you can own that can potentially point to any of your particular addresses. Okay, so you can see here, my last action on the Ethereum network at this address was interacting with the Optimism gateway. But if I select the same address on a different network, so Optimism is a different network if you haven't heard of it before, but I didn't want to go into too much detail, just wanting to show you what it might look like. You can see it's different here. And why is that? It's because they're essentially separated from each other to try and put it as simply as possible, and you might need to use some kind of service to go between the two. Just to give you a better idea, even though you can see it's the same address. All right, let's see if my Ledger Live is open. Yes, perfect. And we'll get that firmware updated like I mentioned before. And then we'll go into some other best practices and stuff like that, and making sure you guys are all safe. So you see it's saying allow Ledger Manager. Click on both the buttons to allow the Ledger Manager, and the My Ledger tab will open up. So, okay, so just while that's loading up, I do see one question there with regards to any assets. So I can see CryptoCroc. Okay. I can see that you've mentioned some funds have been taken without your consent. What I might mention for you, CryptoCroc, if you do have the case ID, you can pop that into the chat. I can jot that down here. We can potentially have a look at that if you need, and go from there. We wouldn't be able to potentially like try and get your funds back or anything like that. That would be something we liaise with law enforcement potentially, or whoever, to try and help you as much as we can. But yeah, definitely drop the case number in there. We'll try and give you a hand as best we can. But now we will update the firmware. So you can just click on the top there on the orange tab. And you can see here what is new. Fixing various bugs. I know that I have my recovery phrase for this test device in particular as well. So the reason that we'd ask you if you have it, so let's say for whatever reason, the update of the device, something goes awry. Let's say you lose power or something weird like that happens. And it doesn't finish, it might reset the device back to factory settings. It doesn't mean that you've lost your assets if you have your recovery phrase. The reason that the recovery phrase is important is then you can, because it deterministically, when you put the recovery phrase in, and once I use the applications as an example, it'll use the correct or specific derivation path to get the address and the private key so that it can check and deterministically get that same address to manage those assets. So it's really important to make sure that you keep that recovery phrase. If you lose that and you lose the device, for example, we wouldn't have any backup to it at all. We would only be able to, we could probably, show you what's happened on chain. If let's say your recovery phrase has been compromised, we can work with police, like I mentioned. But yeah, make sure you keep that recovery phrase secure. It's probably the most important thing. Next thing is don't sign any transactions that you don't know, that you don't trust. That's the other thing I normally mention as well. CryptoCroc, I did see your case number in there just as a heads up, just so you know. So I'll take a look at that after. Okay, so you can see here it's installing the firmware, and I'll go through after that other applications we can install, as well as maybe some issues that might happen surrounding firmware. For example, if your device is asking to install new applications, to update your Ethereum application all the time, for example, it might mean that you haven't updated the firmware and the latest version of the application isn't up to date. And so it's always asking to update the firmware, the application. All right, guys, hopefully the audio is back. Sorry about that, guys. Just had to fix that up. But boom. So you can see here in Ledger Live, it's waiting for me to input my PIN and then get that all sorted. Boom. Again, don't use this PIN number. This is a really bad practice. But obviously this is on my real. Oh, and you can see here, I did have some applications there and they're gone. That's totally okay. That's totally normal. It just means that we just need to reinstall them. Sorry about the audio again. So I did see a question that I did want to touch on. I only have capacity available on my Nano S. Could I uninstall all the apps and install Ethereum and Songbird? Do I lose assets, coins for apps I uninstalled? That's Jose Lenny Solidum that asked that, and no, you did not. You do not. I just wanted to mention it's the you were the question I was reading when I just lost audio. So I think that I mentioned that before. Let's say in this case, like you can see, the update has actually uninstalled the apps. I can either go down here and reinstall the applications directly, or you can go to my Ledger rather, and install them individually as well. So hopefully that answers your question with regards to uninstalling those applications. So it is a bit of a, it is a bit less convenient. I totally understand to uninstall applications and then reinstall them when you're managing with a Ledger Nano S in particular. But it is definitely something you can do. For example, I actually use this Ledger device as my doing certain passwords and things like that, and I don't have all of my all of the applications on it, even though I know the Ethereum address, I know the Bitcoin address for a couple of them, so I can actually go in and actually send money to the accounts that are managed by the recovery phrase that it uses. I see another question as well. While that's all downloading and installing, can you set up a buy limit from your ledger without having to use Binance feature and leave coin keys on exchange? So I think there's a bit of a, there's a couple of things that I need to touch on with that, Justin. Limit orders. So limit orders being you don't do it at market price, being that you set a specific price level that you want to either buy or sell. And you wanted to only buy or sell at a specific price level. You wouldn't necessarily be doing that with any centralized exchange, right? And you mentioned Binance. Binance is something where it is a custodial solution. It is somewhere, and I'll just open up Binance, for example. It's somewhere where they own the keys. So technically you own the coins by them, being on your name, but in essence, they are, a number to your name in particular, kind of like a bank. The bank, holds the money for you and you spend it with the card. In this case, with Binance, they hold your Bitcoin, and if you're trading, let's say, on a, what do you call it, on spot. So if you're trading BTC to USDT, BTC to USDC, then all your assets are on Binance, and Binance is managing those assets. Now, with that being said, it is definitely something you can do without an exchange, where you continue to hold the keys to your assets. What are those services? Those services would be something called decentralized exchanges. One of the biggest ones would be Uniswap. And I'm just going there now. It would be something that I might suggest testing with a smaller amount of funds first, and maybe doing so across any networks. But the reason that I'd suggest that is that it is not as simple as using a centralized exchange. There are, things to consider in terms of like when things happen, like in terms of troubleshooting, in terms of time that it takes for a transaction to go through, liquidity and things like that as well as, potentially ways that malicious actors can get a hold of your assets or make you sign transactions that might put your assets at risk. So it is definitely something that you might want to consider once you get a better, a better understanding, or if you feel more comfortable. Once you feel more comfortable, you're sending, 5 USDT here and there, you're getting used to it. And this is probably something you can put on after you've sent to off your exchange, and you've received your assets on chain. So now you own the keys to the assets, right? Actually, Gibbons, I see that question and I want to answer that really well. So Gibbons, why DEX is so underdeveloped for BTC. I'm going to put a note in that because I really want to answer that. But I'll just finish my point here. If we're going to be using decentralized exchanges to make a limit order, let's just connect my wallet and we'll get that started. So in this case, when you connect to decentralized applications as opposed to centralized applications, so You might have seen before on Binance it had asked me to sign in with like Google or my email, and that's a way to identify me. With the decentralized applications, how do we identify each other? We use our addresses, right? So we can use MetaMask, which is a third-party wallet. In our case, let's say we're just using decentralized exchanges over Ethereum. Let's just use Wallet Connect. Wallet Connect, please don't scan this and do it yourself. That would be, but I will go to my Ledger Live and I'll go to my account. Did I add that in yet? I did not. So we can go about and we can add the account and then we can connect through, our Ethereum account. Boom. So let's add the account first. But I'll continue on what I wanted to talk about with terms of a Uniswap. Once we've logged in, we can swap any asset for asset. One thing to note is that you wouldn't be able to send, USD, like fiat currency. I wouldn't be able to send like from a bank, right? But if you have heard, there are things called like stable coins, which might emulate, what a fiat currency value might be. Boom. Let's just get out of that. Let's see what might be happening here. There we go. So you can probably, let's say, sell your Ethereum for USDC, and then buy back on a decentralized exchange. When you do want to then subsequently change for to be able to spend that money with a card, you can use, an example would be the CL card, something that you can find within the Discover section that you can see just under accounts here. And I'll get into that actually once I finish adding these accounts in. But let's say you got a CL card, which is a card where you can input some assets and then you can spend that money. You can spend it via like Visa, MasterCard. It's actually a service that we work with another company to offer. You could potentially use that. I've personally used other services as well, so it's not like we try to lock you in. So there's things like crypto.com. There are, I think in Europe, there's other cards as well that you can use too, to actually spend that money. So I'm going to actually just log in with my MetaMask just to get around this and go real quick. And we'll go from there, just to show you what the interface would look like and things like that, and show you, get to the end point about limit orders and stuff like that, because it is an option only some exchanges have. And then we'll get to that point about Bitcoin and exchanges and decentralized exchanges, to be more specific. Let's see if I can answer any other quicker questions first. So if I have my 24-word recovery phrase, could I access my account on a non-ledger device? Yep, okay, looks like my colleague answered that. Boom. Okay. Boom. Am I gonna get doxxed just by putting my address in there? Now, one thing to note as well, with using MetaMask, we do have a big article about this as well, is that, looks like it's not having the best time with me doing so many windows, but boom, there we go. Let's just close some of these. You can use third-party wallets like MetaMask without importing your recovery phrase by using a Connect hardware wallet feature. Personally, whenever I see that, whenever I do that in particular, I always suggest Ledger, MetaMask, and then there's an article here with regards to that. So let's do USDC, for example. I'm on Optimism at the moment. That's fine for what we're doing right now, just to give you just to show you what I mean for decentralized exchanges. Boom. And you can see here, this would be a market order. I know 1 inch has limit orders, which means you only sell once you get to that price in particular. So just to wrap that up, I probably rambled a bit too much with regards to that, given this. So one thing to mention why DEX is so underdeveloped for BTC. They are underdeveloped because of the smart contract functionality or lack of that Bitcoin might have, as opposed to Ethereum. That is my personal experience, and that even though that kind of functionality is, that capability is here, we haven't seen the infrastructure yet to build that. So it is something that I think is on the way, but as you've noticed, it's not something that is very common, and I hope to see a lot more of that in the future. And interoperability is going to be probably the next thing that I think is being big on the horizon, in my personal opinion, even though that's probably terrible financial advice. So I'm not here offering any financial advice, obviously. But yes, you did mention, can you comment on why or why not someone might use a password manager or for a passphrase, not keys, of course. So to comment why or why not someone might use it, it might be easier for them. I don't know. If I am imagining that they have some kind of deep dark storage where they have like a 50 character passphrase, and their recovery phrase is like, in 3 different places, like what is the word, like Horcrux style, and it's everywhere, and you're being really ridiculously secure. I mean, even then, honestly, I can't think of a perfect thing. I can't think that that's the best reason to use a password manager. The only reason I could think that given someone might use a password manager for that is it's extra long. It's a bit hard to remember. Personally, I just write my passphrases down, or I use blocks to make ultimately complex passphrases that I can remember easily. But personally, I don't use a password manager for any passwords that I use on a regular basis. What I actually do, I think I mentioned it before, I've got this Ledger Nano S. What I actually do is this is not having a good day. I will show that in a second. But what you can do is you can go to the My Ledger tab and you can use the Passwords app. I prefer that much more, being that it is reproducible based on the nickname of the password that you use. And so, and the recovery phrase. So you can use this across devices to have the same password. And like I mentioned, I use a block of those to create really, really complex passwords without having to either manually type the passwords or anything like that. So just something to consider. I'll just show passwords. Okay, so it's not there because I got to go to developer mode, if I remember correctly. But hopefully that answers. Hopefully that answers more of your question. I know I didn't really get into it. I can't imagine the positive for using a password manager to manage that asset, any assets or any passphrases rather. Okay, let me just show you guys the Passwords app because it's one of my favorites, honestly. And if you guys aren't using it, I definitely recommend it. So I'm going to try and answer some of the questions in the chat now as well, since we're probably needing to just about wrap up with regards to this session as well. So again, if you have any questions, get a hold of us at support.ledger.com. We can try and answer any questions that you have before you've ordered, after, if you're having trouble getting set up in particular. Please, please, please keep your recovery phrase secure. Don't give it to anyone. We will never ask for it. We'll never ask for your PIN. And please, guys, please don't sign any transactions that seem shady, or like, if it's too good to be true, it's generally is. I didn't go into some general best practices, but what I might mention would be securing that recovery phrase. I think I mentioned already. Making sure you have your device secure, not just waving it around or anything like that. There we go. That's it there. Two-factor authentication. So if you're using because I use exchanges still to, buy funds and things like that, use two-factor authentication with everything. Okay. Better to use the one with your Google Authenticator, for example, than to use one with a phone SIM, because my understanding is that there's more and more phone SIM swap scams. And last of all, always, like I tried to do today, keep your firmware up to date. It's probably one of the bigger things that we suggest to mitigate any security issues that you might come across. It is one of the more important things, along with two-factor authentication, and the ultimate being recovery phrase is the backup to any of your assets. So if I lost all of my my bag, all of my devices, everything like that, because I have my recovery phrase secure, then I can always go back. I can even put that into like a software wallet quickly, just to send it out to an address that I already that I have, for example, and spend that if I need it, or whatever it might be. I think the other thing I would mention is that there were a bunch of ticket numbers in the chat as well, so we'll try and get to all of those as best we can. I think there is one question here. Can you introduce the access? Let me just open that up a bit. Eric, can you introduce multi-factor authentication access for Ledger Live instead of password? I don't think that that would be on the timeline. I'll definitely put that in as a request, like my colleague mentioned. I think part of it is that one thing to note, and I'm going to quickly wrap this up as the last thing, would be that what is stored on here. So in the instance of Ledger Live, there's no personal, there's no information that would allow anyone to manage the assets. So even if someone got a hold of your computer, they wouldn't be able to manage the assets. With regards to that as well, if you've got a password on there, it'll be encrypted too. So that's something to consider as well. The password is enough there to stop anyone from even knowing the addresses that you're using. The multi-factor authentication for me would be kind of too much, because it'll be the device that's your multi-factor authentication. But that's kind of where I think about it. But that is my normal opinion. Other than that, get a hold of us at support.ledger.com. We'll try to give you a hand from there. And thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks.